The cold seeped through Sarah's thin jacket, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air and everything to do with the splintering of her world. She sat on the curb, her son Leo's small, shivering body curled into her side, his face buried in her arm. Across the manicured lawn, the front door to her own home stood closed, a solid oak barrier guarded by a smirking face in the window. The face belonged to a man named Marcus, though he was less a man and more a vulture who had found a carcass. He and his two companions had moved in while she and Leo were at her mother's funeral, and with a forged lease and a brazen understanding of squatters' rights, they had stolen her life from under her. The lock had been changed. Her key was now just a useless piece of metal. Humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crawled up her neck even as the cold bit at her fingers. It was in the twitching curtains of her neighbors' houses, the fleeting glances from people walking their dogs, the way they hurried past, their gazes fixed on the pavement. They were all watching. Mrs. Gable from number 42, with her prize-winning roses. Mr. Henderson from across the street, who borrowed her husband's ladder just last summer and never returned it. They saw her, a single mother cast out onto the street, and they did nothing. Their silence was an accusation, a judgment that she must have done something to deserve this. Their silence was a wall, as impenetrable as her own front door. Leo stirred, his voice a small, sleepy murmur. "Mommy, I'm cold. Can we go inside now?" The question was a shard of glass in her heart. She pulled him closer, her arms a fragile shield against the encroaching dusk. "Soon, sweetie. We're just waiting for some people to help." It was a lie, and the taste of it was bitter. She had already called for help. The police had come and gone, their visit a masterclass in bureaucratic indifference. Marcus appeared on the porch, leaning against the railing David had built with his own two hands. He held a can of beer, the condensation dripping onto the wood. He took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes locking onto hers. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His posture, his smug satisfaction, screamed his victory. He was inside, warm and safe in her life, while she was outside, exposed and broken. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was on the losing side, a spectacle for a silent, judging audience. A quiet desperation began to set in, a creeping fear that this curb, this cold patch of concrete, was not a temporary setback but the beginning of a permanent fall. The first tendrils of hopelessness wrapped around her, cold and tight, and she had to fight the urge to scream, not in anger, but in pure, unadulterated terror. The sun dipped lower, casting long, accusatory shadows that stretched from her neighbors' homes, pointing directly at her and her son. The arrival of the police cruiser had initially felt like a cavalry charge, a beacon of order in the chaos. A younger officer, his face earnest and etched with concern, had listened intently as Sarah, her voice trembling, explained the situation. He took notes, nodded sympathetically, and assured her they would sort it out. But his partner, a man whose weary eyes had seen this particular brand of human ugliness 1,000 times before, had merely sighed. He was the one who knocked on the door. Marcus answered, a picture of aggrieved tenancy. He produced a piece of paper, a lease agreement, crudely printed from the internet, with her forged signature scrawled at the bottom. "We have a contract, officer," he'd said, his tone oozing false sincerity. "She's trying to evict us illegally. We know our rights." The older officer, whose name tag read Miller, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on Sarah, had taken the document, his expression unchanging. He'd looked from the paper to Sarah, then back to Marcus. "This is a civil matter, ma'am," he'd stated, the words prepackaged and devoid of feeling. It was a line he had delivered countless times, a verbal shrug that absolved him of responsibility. "Civil," Sarah's voice cracked. "He broke into my house. He changed my locks. My son's medication is in there, his clothes, everything we own." Her desperation was a raw, open wound. "Do you have proof he broke in?" Officer Miller asked, his tone flat. "Or did he just enter an unlocked door? Did you serve him with a formal eviction notice?" "He's not a tenant. I've never seen him before in my life, she pleaded, gesturing wildly at the smug man on the porch. Marcus just shook his head sadly. She's been under a lot of stress lately. Her memory, it's not what it used to be. The poison in his words was potent. It planted a seed of doubt, a convenient excuse for inaction. The younger officer looked conflicted, but his senior partner was already turning away, his mind on the next call, the next piece of paperwork. You'll have to take it to court, Miller said over his shoulder. Get a lawyer. The process takes time. There's nothing we can do here. Our hands are tied. Tied. The word echoed in the space between them. Their hands were tied by procedure, by the very laws designed to protect, now twisted into a weapon against her. Marcus's smirk widened into a triumphant grin as the officers retreated to their car. He leaned forward, his voice a low, mocking whisper meant only for her. The system works, sweetheart. Just not for you. She had watched the cruiser pull away, its flashing lights disappearing around the corner, taking with them her last sliver of hope. The door to her home had clicked shut, a sound of absolute finality. The system had not just failed her. It had actively sided with her tormentor. The law, which she had always believed to be a shield for the innocent, was now the cage that held her out while predators feasted on her life. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Leo had started to cry then, a soft, confused whimper that cut deeper than any insult Marcus could ever hurl. She had picked him up, carried him to the curb, and sat down on the cold concrete, the full weight of the state's indifference pressing down on her, heavier than any physical burden she had ever known. The world was not just unjust. It was absurd. The chill deepened, and Sarah pulled Leo's thin hoodie tighter around him, her mind retreating from the harsh present to the warmth of memory. She found a small, secluded bench in the corner of a nearby park, under the sprawling branches of an old oak tree that David had once pointed out, saying it had probably been there since the town was founded. David, her husband, everything always came back to him. This house wasn't just wood and nails. It was a testament to his love. She remembered the day he'd brought her to see it, a small, slightly run-down bungalow that others overlooked. But David had seen its potential. He was a Marine, a sergeant, a man who saw structure and possibility where others saw only disrepair. Good bones, Sarah, he'd said, his arm wrapped around her waist. All it needs is some love. And he had poured his love into it. He'd spent his weekends on leave replacing the siding, sanding the floors until they shone, and building the porch swing where they'd spent countless evenings watching the fireflies. Each nail he hammered, each board he sawed, was a promise of a future together, a future that had been stolen by an IED in a dusty, faraway land. Now, squatters were drinking beer on his promise. Their dirty shoes were scuffing the floors he had so lovingly restored. Sarah clutched the worn strap of her purse, her fingers brushing against the cool leather of her wallet. Inside was a faded photograph she always carried. It was of David, not in his dress blues, but in a worn t-shirt and jeans, standing next to a gleaming motorcycle. He was younger, his smile wider, more carefree. He was flanked by a group of men who looked nothing like his fellow Marines. They were rougher, bearded, clad in leather vests covered in patches. David wasn't wearing a vest, but he had his arms slung over the shoulder of a mountain of a man with a graying beard, and he looked completely at home. He had called them his road brothers. It was a part of his life before he'd enlisted, a life he rarely spoke of in detail. They're good men, he'd told her once when she'd asked. They live by a code. Loyalty is everything. You look after your own, no matter what. He'd tapped his heart. Brotherhood isn't always about blood. She'd never met them, never knew their names. They were just ghosts from a past that felt like another lifetime. Now, sitting in the gathering dark, the memory felt less like a curiosity and more like a cruel joke. Brotherhood. Loyalty. Those words felt hollow, meaningless concepts from a world that no longer existed. Her world had shrunk to this cold park bench. Her only brother-in-arms, a 6-year-old boy whose faith in her was the only thing keeping her from shattering completely. She looked back toward her street, at the single warm, yellow light of her living room window, a beacon in a home that was no longer hers. A profound sense of loss washed over her, not just for the house, but for the man who had made it a home, and for the simple, unshakable belief that good things happen to good people. The last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, replaced by the bruised purple of twilight. The temperature dropped sharply, and a damp wind rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, making them whisper like ghosts. Leo's shivering grew more pronounced, his small teeth chattering despite her embrace. The reality of their situation settled in with the cold. They had nowhere to go. Her cell phone was a lifeline, but a dying one. The battery icon glowed a menacing red. 7%. With fumbling, numb fingers, she dialed the number for the county's emergency shelter. A tired voice answered, reciting a script of compassion that felt utterly rehearsed. "I'm sorry, we're at full capacity. The cold snap has brought a lot of people in. You can try calling back in the morning." Click. She tried another number, a family crisis center. A recorded message informed her their office hours were 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. It was Thursday night. The system, it seemed, only offered help during business hours, as if homelessness and desperation were polite enough to keep a schedule. Legal aid was the same, a voicemail box that was, predictably, full. Each failed call was another brick in the wall being built around her. She was being systematically erased, rendered invisible by the very institutions meant to see her. She looked around the park. A few homeless people were settling into their makeshift shelters for the night, pulling thin blankets over their heads. They didn't look at her with judgment, but with a weary recognition. They knew this path. She was just a newcomer. The weight of the neighborhood's gaze returned, even though she was blocks away. She could feel it, the burning shame of their pity and suspicion. Why hadn't she paid her mortgage? Was she on drugs? What kind of mother lets this happen? The questions they were too polite to ask screamed in the silence. Their inaction was a verdict, and she had been found guilty. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Leo's voice was small, a fragile plea in the vast, uncaring darkness. His words jolted her from her paralysis. Hunger. It was a simple, primal need she could actually address. She checked her wallet, a crumpled $10 bill and a few coins. It wasn't much, but it was enough for something warm. A block away, the neon sign of a 24-hour diner cast a warm, inviting glow. "Okay, baby," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Let's go get some hot chocolate. Everything will be okay." She stood up, her joints stiff from the cold, and took Leo's hand. As they walked toward the light of the diner, she felt like a sailor on a sinking ship, swimming toward a distant lighthouse, not knowing if it signaled a safe harbor or just another set of rocks to crash upon. The pressure was immense, a physical force threatening to crush her spirit. But for Leo, she had to keep swimming. She had to believe that the light meant safety, even if every instinct told her the storm was far from over. The diner was an oasis of warmth and light, smelling of stale coffee and hot grease. The clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation felt like sounds from another world, a world where people had homes to return to. Sarah guided Leo to a small booth in the corner, her body slumping onto the cracked vinyl seat with a weary sigh. She ordered a hot chocolate for Leo and a black coffee for herself, counting the coins in her palm to make sure she had enough for a tip. The $10 bill remained folded in her pocket, a final emergency reserve. As Leo wrapped his small hands around the warm mug, a look of pure contentment on his face, Sarah scanned the room. Her eyes landed on an old man sitting alone at the counter. He was wiry and weathered, his face a roadmap of hard years. He wore a faded, tattered army jacket, the kind David had once worn when doing yard work. The man was counting out a pile of change, his gnarled fingers carefully arranging the nickels and dimes. The waitress, a young woman with a tired, impatient expression, stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot. "It's $4.50 for the special," the waitress said, her voice sharp. "You're short $1. The old man's shoulders slumped. A deep, painful flush crept up his neck. He mumbled something about miscalculating, his voice thick with shame. He started to push his plate away, the half-eaten meal of meatloaf and mashed potatoes suddenly an object of humiliation. Sarah watched, and her heart ached. She saw not a stranger, but a reflection of David's fierce pride, of the dignity he held so dear. She imagined David in that position, old and forgotten, having served his country only to be shamed over the price of a hot meal. The thought was unbearable. In that moment, her own desperate situation faded into the background. There was a hurt here she could actually fix. Before she could second-guess herself, she slid out of the booth, walked to the counter, and took the $10 bill from her pocket. She placed it quietly on the counter next to the old man's pile of change. "He's covered," she said softly to the waitress. "And please, let him finish his meal." The waitress looked from the money to Sarah, her expression softening slightly, a flicker of surprise in her tired eyes. The old man turned slowly on his stool, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue, and in their depths, she saw a storm of emotions. Shock, confusion, and then a profound, silent gratitude that was more eloquent than any words could ever be. He didn't speak. He simply gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of respect from one weary soul to another. As he turned back to his plate, Sarah caught a glimpse of a faded tattoo on his forearm, partially hidden by his jacket sleeve. A skull with ragged wings. It meant nothing to her then. She had simply seen a veteran, a brother in a silent fraternity of hardship, and she had acted. She returned to her booth, her pocket empty, but her heart a little less heavy. Mrs. Gable, from number 42, couldn't sleep. The image of Sarah and her little boy sitting on the curb, looking so lost and alone, was seared into her mind. She had watched from behind her pristine lace curtains, her heart a knot of pity and fear. Fear because it was easier to believe Sarah had brought this upon herself. Pity because deep down she knew it wasn't true. She knew Sarah was a good woman, a devoted mother who had lost her husband in the war. And Mrs. Gable had done nothing but watch. Unable to settle, she had driven to the all-night pharmacy to pick up a prescription. On her way back, she decided to stop at the diner for a cup of tea, and through the large plate glass window, she saw it all. She saw Sarah, looking ashen and exhausted with her son, and she saw the old veteran at the counter, the shame on his face as he came up short for his meal. Then, she witnessed the impossible. She saw Sarah, a woman who had just lost everything, walk to the counter and pay for the old man's food with what looked like her last bit of money. It was an act of such quiet, selfless grace that it struck Mrs. Gable like a physical blow. Shame, hot and overwhelming, washed over her. She had a warm bed, a full pantry, a safe home. Sarah had nothing. And yet, it was Sarah who was showing compassion, while she, a pillar of the community, had done nothing but hide behind her curtains. She drove home, the tea forgotten, her mind racing. She went straight to her husband, who was watching television. "Harold," she said, her voice shaking, "we were wrong. We just watched. We did nothing." The story, once spoken aloud, gained a life of its own. Harold called Mr. Henderson across the street. Mrs. Gable started a group text with the other women on the block. The narrative began to shift. The whispers of judgment turned into murmurs of concern, then into exclamations of outrage on Sarah's behalf. The image of the smug squatter on the porch was replaced by the image of a grieving widow being kicked out of her home, and the image of a desperate mother giving her last dollars to a hungry stranger. The wall of silence began to crumble, brick by brick. An hour after her act of kindness in the diner, as Sarah and Leo huddled outside, the warmth of the hot chocolate long gone, a car pulled up. It was Mrs. Gable. She got out, her face etched with a mixture of apology and resolve. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She handed Sarah a thick wool blanket and a large thermos. "It's tomato soup," she said softly. "It's not much, but it's hot." It was the first crack of light in a long, dark night. As Sarah wrapped the warm blanket around Leo, the scent of home-cooked soup filling the cold air, she felt something she hadn't felt in hours. She was no longer completely invisible. The community had been silent, But now, one by one, they were starting to find their voice. It was a small gesture, a cup of soup and a blanket, but it was a beginning. The sound began as a feeling, a low-frequency vibration that hummed through the soles of Sarah's worn sneakers, through the cold concrete of the sidewalk. It was a distant rumble, like far-off thunder on a clear night. It grew steadily, resolving itself from a feeling into a sound. A deep, guttural growl that was somehow both menacing and melodic. People started to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unusual noise that was tearing through the quiet fabric of their suburban Thursday night. Lights flicked on in upstairs windows. Doors opened. Then the first one appeared. It turned onto their street, a massive, gleaming beast of black steel and chrome, its single headlight cutting a bright slash through the darkness. A Harley-Davidson, ridden by a figure clad in dark leather. It was followed by another, and then another, a seemingly endless procession of motorcycles pouring into the residential lane. They moved with a practiced, almost military precision, fanning out to line both sides of the street, their engines idling in a deafening percussive chorus. The air grew thick with the smell of exhaust and hot metal. It wasn't a gang. It was an army. The sheer number was staggering. 50, 100, more. They filled the entire block, a river of polished chrome and worn leather that reflected the streetlights in 1,000 glittering points of light. 137 bikes, Sarah would later learn. They formed a loose but unmistakable perimeter around her house, their presence an overwhelming statement of intent. Inside the house, the living room light went out. The squatters were no longer visible. From the center of the phalanx, a rider dismounted. He was taller than the rest, with a long, graying beard braided into 2 sections. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man in absolute command. His leather vest, or cut, was covered in patches, but one stood out on his chest. Prez. He didn't look towards the house. His eyes scanned the street until they found Sarah, huddled with Leo under the blanket Mrs. Gable had given her. He began to walk towards her, his heavy boots sounding like drumbeats on the pavement. The roar of the engines subsided to a low, rumbling idle, the collective sound like a great beast holding its breath. The entire neighborhood was silent, watching. As the president of the motorcycle club approached, another man emerged from the ranks and fell into step beside him. It was the old veteran from the diner, the man with the faded army jacket and the grateful eyes. He no longer looked stooped or ashamed. Standing beside his brother, he looked transformed, his posture straight, his gaze clear and steady. He had a place. He belonged. And he had brought his family with him. The big man with the braided beard stopped a few feet from Sarah. He towered over her, a mountain of leather and denim, but his eyes, when they met hers, were not unkind. They were serious, intense, and filled with a purpose that sent a shiver down her spine. Not of fear, but of something else entirely, something she hadn't felt since David was alive. Felt like protection. "Ma'am." The man's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, a sound that seemed to emanate from his chest. "My name is Preacher. Are you Sarah Miller?" Sarah, still clutching the thermos of soup, could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. She glanced at the old veteran beside him, a flicker of recognition and confusion on her face. Preacher followed her gaze. "This here is Scab," he said, clapping a heavy hand on the old man's shoulder. "He's one of ours. He told us what you did for him tonight at the diner. How you gave him your last $10 for a meal." He paused, letting the weight of the statement hang in the air. "But that's not the only reason we're here." Scab recognized something when he was talking to you. A name. He asked if your last name was Miller, and then he asked about your husband. Preacher's intense gaze softened with something that looked like reverence. "Your husband? Was he Sergeant David Miller? U.S. Marine Corps?" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She nodded again, unable to speak the words. "We knew him as Ghost," Preacher said, a sad smile touching his lips. The name hit her like a physical blow. Ghost. It was the name stitched on an old, dusty patch in David's memory box, a name she'd never understood. Preacher's voice grew softer, filled with a history she was only now learning. David rode with us before he enlisted. He wasn't a patched member, he was too straight arrow for the life, but he was blood. He was family. When my own cousin got pinned down in Fallujah, it was Sergeant Ghost Miller who went in alone and pulled him out. Saved his life. David never told us about it, we heard it from my cousin. That's the kind of man he was. He looked from Sarah to the house, his expression hardening into cold fury. We made a promise to him a long time ago, that we'd always look out for our own. Ghost's family is our family. His house is our house. He swept a hand back at the silent army of bikers lining the street. An insult to his memory is an insult to every single one of us. We're here to collect on a debt of honor, ma'am. This is not your fight anymore. It's ours. The truth was finally revealed, not as a whisper, but as the roar of 137 engines, a brotherhood of loyalty she never knew existed, arriving to answer a call she had never made. The bikers did not storm the house. Their method was far more unnerving. Preacher, flanked by Scab and two other formidable-looking members, walked calmly up the driveway and onto the porch David had built. They didn't knock. They simply stood there, for silent, imposing figures whose very presence was a suffocating pressure on the people inside. After a long minute, the door creaked open and Marcus appeared. He tried to project an air of bravado, but his face was pale and his eyes darted nervously from Preacher to the sea of bikers that had materialized on his stolen doorstep. "This is private property," he blustered, his voice a few octaves higher than usual. "You're trespassing." Preacher didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet rumble of the idling engines provided all the amplification he needed. "We're here to discuss the fraudulent document you're using to occupy this property," he said, his voice calm and level, which was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "Our lawyer, who is on his way, was very interested to see the photo our friend Scab took of your lease." He pointed out several interesting flaws. "For starters, the signature of the landlord is forged. More importantly, you backdated it, but you used a document template that wasn't available online until 3 months after the date you claimed it was signed. That's fraud. A felony." Marcus's face went from pale to ghostly white. "Now," Preacher continued, taking a small step forward, "you can wait for the police to get here. We've already called them, by the way. Explained the new evidence of criminal fraud. Or you and your friends can vacate the premises immediately. We have 137 club members here who would be more than happy to stand as witnesses to your continued trespassing. They're very observant. They'll notice every little thing." The threat was clear, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. It wasn't about violence. It was about overwhelming psychological warfare. The legal loophole the squatters had exploited had been turned back on them, magnified by an intimidating force they could never hope to match. Marcus stared at the unblinking eyes of the bikers, at the sheer, immovable wall of loyalty standing on the lawn, and his false courage crumbled into dust. He disappeared inside, and moments later, he and his two companions scrambled out the back door, melting into the darkness of the backyard like the vermin they were. A few bikers, including one they called Tiny, who was the size of a refrigerator, did a slow, methodical sweep of the house to ensure it was empty and undamaged. Another member, a locksmith by trade, had the cheap lock Marcus had installed drilled out and replaced with a heavy-duty deadbolt in under 5 minutes. Preacher walked back down to Sarah, who was now standing, Leo holding tightly to her hand. He held out a new set of keys. "It's yours again, ma'am. Safe and sound." As she took them, her hand trembling, another biker approached. He was older, with kind eyes, and he held a small, beautifully framed object. It was a single, embroidered patch. On it was a grinning skull and the name Ghost. "This was his," the biker said gently. "His road patch. He left it with us for safekeeping when he shipped out. Said he'd be back for it. I guess in a way he handed it to Sarah. He always belongs with us. Which means you do, too." The transformation of the neighborhood was complete. Fear had been replaced by awe, and then by a communal sense of purpose. Neighbors who had hidden behind their curtains were now emerging with offerings. Trays of sandwiches, pots of coffee, cases of water. They approached the intimidating bikers not with trepidation, but with gratitude, their small suburban community joining forces with this unlikely legion of guardians. Respect had been earned, and a new, stronger community was being forged in the glow of the Harley headlights. Sarah stood on her porch, the new keys cold and solid in one hand, David's framed patch warm in the other. She pushed the newly unlocked door open and stepped inside. The air was stale with the scent of strangers, but beneath it was the faint, familiar smell of her life, of home. She walked through the living room, her fingers tracing the back of the sofa, and went straight to Leo's room. He was asleep in her arms, exhausted by the emotional tumult. She laid him gently in his own bed, pulling his favorite dinosaur-patterned comforter up to his chin. He was safe. The thought was so powerful, so overwhelming, it brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. These were not tears of sorrow, but of profound, bone-deep relief. Outside, the street had transformed into a surreal tableau. Hardened, leather-clad bikers, men who looked like they could tear the world apart with their bare hands, were quietly accepting cups of coffee from Mrs. Gable. Mr. Henderson was locked in an animated conversation with Tiny about the best way to reinforce a fence. A biker who had introduced himself as Slam, a carpenter by trade, was already taking measurements of the broken porch swing, his tools laid out neatly on the grass. They weren't an occupying army. They were a restoration crew. They were a protective wall of loyalty, standing guard over the memory of their fallen brother. Sarah looked out the front window at the sea of chrome and leather glinting under the streetlights, a sight that hours ago would have terrified her. Now, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a symbol not of menace, but of a fierce, unshakable honor she thought had vanished from the world. Mrs. Gable caught her eye and came up to the porch, pulling Sarah into a tight, tearful hug. "We're so sorry, Sarah," she whispered. "We should have done something." "You did," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You brought soup." As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, the bikers began to stir. The quiet conversations ended. Coffee cups were returned. Tools were packed away. They moved with the same quiet efficiency with which they had arrived. Preacher walked up to the porch one last time. He looked at the newly repaired porch swing, where Slam had just finished replacing the broken slat. He gave Sarah a solemn nod. "Our numbers are in your phone now. You call, we come. Always. That's the code." Then came the symphony. One by one, the engines roared to life, a cascading thunder that vibrated through the very foundation of the house. It was not an angry sound, but a declaration, a promise to all who could hear that this house, and the family within it, were under their protection. With a final, collective roar, they pulled away, a river of steel flowing back out of the quiet suburban street, leaving peace in their wake. Sarah sat on her newly fixed porch swing, gently rocking, holding David's patch to her heart. The world was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of loneliness or abandonment. It was the silence of a sanctuary, a home defended, a peace guarded by the lingering, benevolent echo of 137 brothers. She was not just a single mom anymore. She was Ghost's widow, a cherished member of a family she never knew she had, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, truly home.